Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Mike Holland. I'm the Director of Workforce Development Strategy at the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, and I'm excited to welcome you all to this important conversation focused on the topic of how employers can create an apprentice-ready workplace. But before we dive in, I just have some brief housekeeping. The first is to let you know that this virtual session is brought to you by the Chamber's signature workforce development program, and that is the Massachusetts Apprentice Network. The Massachusetts Apprentice Network brings together employers, training and talent providers, and community-based organizations that are committed to expanding the apprenticeship model throughout the Commonwealth, both as a way to help employers solve their current and future hiring needs, and at the same time, create more pathways into wealth-building careers for the region's untapped talent. We currently have 16 total employers in the network that have collectively placed 446 apprentices in their organizations since we launched in 2022. We are committed to increasing that number to 1,000 apprentices by the end of 2027. If you'd like to learn more about the Massachusetts Apprentice Network, please check out our link that was just put into the chat, and feel free to contact me with any questions about how you can join the fun. Another great way to learn about the network is to attend our upcoming National Apprenticeship Week celebration on November 20th at Suffolk University. More details, including our great roster of speakers and registration, can be found at the link that just was added to the chat right now. I would like to thank the Mass Business Roundtable and Accenture for their partnership in launching the Massachusetts Apprentice Network, as well as our inaugural funder, the Cummings Foundation, for all their support. And of course, thank you to everyone from the network who is in the audience for this call today. So throughout today's session, please utilize the Q&A feature to submit questions and comments for the panel to react to. We'll try to reserve a good amount of time at the end to address your questions, so please do send them in. All right, housekeeping done. The goal of today's discussion is to leverage the expertise of training providers who have kindly agreed to share their insights into how employers can enhance their apprenticeship programs and overall workplace culture to better serve talent from all communities and all backgrounds. I can think of no better person to lead this conversation than our moderator, Isiana Malord-Cuevas. Isiana is a product management analyst at Accenture. She joined Accenture in May 2022 as an apprentice and graduated from the program in May 2023. Isiana specializes in driving process improvement initiatives, enhancing service delivery, and aligning strategic objectives across public sector clients. With strengths in strategic thinking, relating, responsibility, ideation, and deliberative decision-making, she is committed to fostering diverse and inclusive workplaces while creating innovative solutions that support operational advancements. Thank you, Asiana, for lending your expertise to this session. At this point, I will hand it over to you.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Asiana Malord. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm thrilled to be here moderating this panel and look forward to diving into this great conversation with you all here today. I'm going to open it up to the panelists so that they can introduce themselves as well. Adrian, would you like to go first?
Absolutely. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Adrienne Palameke. I'm the Director of Co-op at Benjamin Franklin Institute of Technology, or Franklin Cummings Tech, as we're known now. And I'm coming to this work with a justice lens. My background is in law and diplomacy with a lot of international work experience. So when I think about access to resources for marginalized groups, in this case, access to an entry point to get into a career, that's where I'm coming from. So again, thank you for being here today. I'll pass it on to Carla.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We're glad to have you here. My name is Carla Abate. I am with Bunker Hill Community College. I am an assistant director in the workforce development department. I come to this with just most recently having a program. Some of you may be familiar with it, BMAS Competitive, and coming from the MAC group, which was over the 15 community colleges working with them, and Bunker Hill was a huge part of that that program. So we've 6 cohorts of that particular program. My background is diverse: healthcare, business, educational, consulting, etc. But I'm just excited to be part of this panel and with everyone to talk about the subject. Emma.
Hello, my name is Emma McLean. I'm the Accessible Apprenticeship Program Manager at Apprenti. We help place people into tech apprenticeship programs, and I support any individuals who are struggling or have disabilities who are participating in our programming. To provide a short visual description of myself today, I'm a white woman with curly brown hair that's about chin length, and I'm wearing a gray sweater. So that's for anyone who might be blind, low vision, or listening to the call today rather than watching it. I'll pass it back to you, Adriana.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So our first question that we have here is, one of the challenges that often comes up for apprentices is imposter syndrome. How should employees address this?
Excellent. I can start off answering that question. So I think when we call something imposter syndrome, we should be careful with that language because it has really become a catch-all in terms of describing what an apprentice might feel when they arrive on the job. So I think it's really important for the employer to be thinking about the ways in which they are supporting their apprentice. We want to ensure that all feedback that we're providing to apprentices is actionable. When feedback is not actionable or general, it may lead the apprentice to feel like they themselves are not welcome in the space, rather than the work that they're doing needs to be modified. I also encourage apprentices and employers to track apprentice successes in writing so that the apprentice has something concrete to refer back to in those periods of time when they might be feeling more unsure. Those are just 2 basic tips. I'll turn it over to my other panelists because I'm sure they have other things to add.
I can speak to that too. I mean, I think the awesome points that Emma has made as well. I think it's important that we're coming from the lens of the value that someone can bring, and not from the deficit of individuals. So while in our programs we talk to our participants about things that they bring and how to navigate in that space, it's important that as someone who is hosting an apprenticeship program, that you're looking at it from what you can learn in this collaborative component versus the deficit of someone coming just because they have a different lived experience than you. So we want to sort of flip that narrative of what we understood of why imposter syndrome terminology came to be, and that it's not utilized in a way to handicap someone, and that we instead look within and how we are supporting people, because obviously we're going to explain to our folks coming in, if you have an apprentice program, those people in the case of Bunker Hill, there might be an education component of it. We're talking about the environment, but it's important that the people who are receiving the apprentices look at it from that perspective. So, that I think that's something important that we've all talked about.
And I'll just add, for the apprentices, something the workplace can provide to them is demonstrating that there's somebody that they can trust, that they're working with, that the company is committed to their success in a different way, so that, apprenticeship is designed as a learning tool, and really reminding them that it's important to learn and that they're expecting them to be there for the duration of the apprenticeship, that this isn't something that you need to worry about getting fired if you make a mistake. So an environment where you're comfortable and confident in asking questions and have that emotional safety of somebody looking after you.
Speaking from my own experience as a former apprentice with Accenture, I'd say that we also had an aspect of a local champion who was basically like pushing us through and making sure that we were meeting all of our metrics and hitting all the goals that we needed to hit. So when there was room for, doubt, or we felt like we weren't doing what we were supposed to do as a former apprentice, I had the joy of having somebody there to be like, hey, actually, it's going to be okay. And I see you and you deserve to be here. And affirming me really helped throughout the process. So that's really awesome. And so my second question now is, some apprentices are experiencing office culture for the first time. How should employers think about addressing this head on?
I'll do this one, and please knock me off my soapbox as I talk about the subject, because we're all passionate about it. So expectations in terms of and you, Asiana, just talked about that, and that piece of someone deserves to be there. They've worked really hard to be in this position, and they want it. So it's coming in with an open expectation. The thing that I would say is for employers to reflect upon their first experience in a space. What was it like? Do you remember when you first started and what that felt like? Many of you have probably been in your career for some time now, so those things, that disconnect piece of getting it done, it's to reflect upon what it was like when you perhaps had a mentor, when you perhaps had somebody else who was working with you. So a culture and an environment that is not just you as the manager, because some of these things come from above, they come down to management level, then you as a middle management need to implement it. So I think it's important is that the environment is a welcoming one, meaning that you also understand who you're getting, that the people within your team, not just you, within your team, are all invested in the success of that individual, and not just success to tick a box, but that this is you really have to champion their experience, and then that turns into how they are welcomed and see their circumstance. I could go on forever, so let someone else speak.
Yeah, I'll just build on a couple of things that Carla touched on. I think if you want somebody to adapt to your culture, you need to do some self-reflection on what is the culture where you're working. Think about what's on the walls. Like Carla said, think about when you were starting off, what's something that nobody taught you, but that you learned. Write that down, share that with your apprentice. Like, think about really tangible ways to do an intentional onboarding with people so that, early on, they know what to expect, and that those sometimes implicit norms really become explicit. Got to think about what those are before you can share that with somebody. So do some reflection work ahead of time. And part of that, one of the great things is all the employers that are here today are starting to do that, are thinking about that.
And I'd love to expand this discussion of office culture to just think a little bit about social spaces as well, which are a huge component of office culture. And I'm going to use the example of an impromptu decision for a group to go to happy hour, and how that might initially seem like a really kind and generous thing. Oh, I'm going to invite the apprentice to join us for this impromptu happy hour. But that might not be as accessible as you might think. One, the apprentice might not have the financial means to feel comfortable going to a happy hour, that they might be working at a lower wage at this time, or maybe coming from a different background where that's a less accessible if it is sort of a surprise and spontaneous opportunity. There may be that the apprentice has a substance use disorder and doesn't want to socialize where alcohol is going to be a component, nor do they want to out themselves in a public space that is something, a part of their experience. Or we might think of if someone is a wheelchair user, for example, they may be using the ride to get from place to place. That's a disability ride share program for people with disabilities, and that needs to be scheduled far in advance. So to cancel the ride is an endeavor, or to change where the ride is picking you up and the time, right? So for that person, it may feel like a nice invitation initially, and perhaps it comes from a kind place, but can actually be quite exclusionary. So I think when thinking about your office culture and what the social components of your office culture are, it may be helpful to think about what are the ways in which we can plan things in advance to give people ample time, as well as thinking about how there might be multiple ways rather than just going to a single happy hour. Could there be an outing that has other drink options? Or could there be something that's maybe not involved with food, that instead we go and see a baseball game or something like that? Maybe it is paid for by the company, right? There's lots of different ways to think about that social component. And there may be many different reasons why an apprentice might not want. So we also want to ensure that we're not incorrectly inscribing that the apprentice just doesn't want to be social or doesn't want to engage with other people merely because they're not interested in engaging in that one spontaneous social endeavor.
Thank you so much, Emma. I like to add to this as well. As an apprentice with Accenture, they did an excellent job of just sharing resources with us. It was already difficult for me, being that I came from a place that I felt a lot of hostility. And so when I started with Accenture, they were like, we have these affinity spaces for you. And so I knew at the top of my head that when I went into the office, I wanted to be very intentional of who I was going to see at the office. And hopefully I was going to see people that looked like me. And so I started around Juneteenth, and it was lovely because we had a culture day, and it was being ran by the AAERG, or Accenture African American Employee Resource Group. And so I got to marry the office culture with also my identity and who I was as an individual, which was able to take off that initial scare that I had coming in. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I wasn't given the resources in the beginning, when all of my expectations were set clear and concise. And they were like, we also have these spaces for you. And so that was really important for me. And I know a lot of individuals, apprentices, success at Accenture. So that's something just to add as well when managing office culture. So we're going to go to, as an education and training provider, what expectations do you set for your apprentices entering the workplace? And conversely, what guidance do you provide to employers? And Adrian, would you like to take this one?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. So, with our students, we're really encouraging them to do some managing up and to set, for example, agendas for regular meetings with their supervisors. We want them to be providing updates on what they're doing, what they're learning, how they're learning it, thinking about providing, asking for feedback. That's when we think about what we're preparing our employers for, we also encourage them to be providing in the moment feedback and regular opportunities for our students to be interacting with their supervisors. So setting aside time for that and not just waiting for the student to speak up or catch them is really important for that success. Another thing that I mentioned briefly and Carla touched on as well is making sure that you're being really explicit about some things that may be explicit norms in your culture, whether that is when you get in the morning that you send out a Slack message saying, good morning, everyone, so they know that you're there, or whether it's what time you're going to lunch. We don't necessarily want our students to be looking around them and guessing when they can take that time off. We want it to be explicit for our students about what the expectations are, so that they don't accidentally latch on to something that they're seeing a senior leader doing that's just not acceptable for someone in their position. So, being clear about what those things are and laying them out for students ahead of time is something really, really important.
I'd love to build on what Adrienne was just talking about and talk a little bit about giving accessible instructions. So when we think about that, I always say, what are we doing, by when, and why are we working on it? So I think a really common thing, I've heard it actually this week even, might be an instruction like, take a look at this document and we'll circle back. I want your thoughts. Now, I've been working in my role for 3.5 years. So when someone sends me that, I do actually know exactly what they're communicating to me. But if I'm new to the workplace, I might think, okay, they want my thoughts. Do they want me to be looking at this for, full edits, or am I just going in for grammatical? Am I writing my thoughts in the document? Am I writing my thoughts in an email? Will I be expected to say these thoughts in a meeting? Right? If I'm an apprentice, I might have no idea what's actually being asked of me in that instruction. Whereas if I get the instruction, please review the attached document for accuracy. The next step is for our marketing team to transform the content into a flyer, and we can't make additional edits after that. Email any revisions to me by the end of the week, right? That took me about 30 additional seconds to read to you than the first sentence, but the apprentice then is not confused at all what those expectations are. And so I think from a managerial perspective, from an employer perspective, that is a really low lift to be asking managers. Hopefully they do have that level of clarity on what they want when they're asking something of the apprentice. And then it ensures that the apprentice, can ask follow-up questions, but doesn't feel like they're being left in that limbo state. So I think employers can really encourage their managers, and we think about this with training instructors too, with assignments, being as clear as possible, especially in those early months, so that we can work up to the point where the apprentice feels like they understand some of that office shorthand.
And one thing to just add on that as well is something that we have to also be mindful of is when we're having those expectations, the thing that we always talk about is to be direct. We've talked about that. These all speak to that. Don't make an assumption. But a big piece that I want to talk about as well is extrovert, introvert. World tends to be very focused on extroverts. And something that we work with is someone who is maybe they're not introverted. It's just culturally in their culture, that's not it's the deferential aspect of you are in a position of leadership. I can't question you. I can't do these types of things. It's the education of the apprentice about that environment, but it's also super important for the people who are hosting apprentices to understand culturally, that might be why someone does something. Or frankly, as people who are introverted, they notice everything. So don't just have this extroverted mindset. I always think of the book Quiet. I always encourage employers to take that, get it from the library, have a copy in your office so that you're familiar with that, because you have a huge strength for people to look at. Not everybody looks the same, not everyone communicates the same, and you'll miss out on a huge population of people by not doing, understanding that. We express to them how you can do that, and also the difference between when we talk about managing up, we talk about that with apprenticeship a lot. But the thing that we have to also understand is if you're coming from a lived experience where you have to navigate, especially governmental scenarios, I have to do certain things to make people like me, to have them help me, to be kinder. And that sometimes managing up, we have to be clear of what that means in this environment, because managing up in an environment to get what I need to survive my daily life is different than what it is in the workspace. So how for someone, it might mean to be blunt, sucking up, just being a nice person and someone responding to that. That is not what we want our folks to learn, because that's limited in terms of what they can achieve. So it's important for us to sort of be very, as we said, directed in that communication, and you're not being condescending when you're being direct. You in fact become more condescending when you're not direct.
Thank you, Carla. So we're going to go to our next question. How should employers think about what success and inclusion looks like for apprentices from all backgrounds and abilities, including the additional resources that might be needed to ensure that success?
Excellent. I'm happy to take the lead on this one. This is Emma. So, as I mentioned earlier, my role at Apprentice is to support individuals with disabilities as they make their way through our programs. And I just want to talk a little bit about disability disclosure. So I think that's really important as we talk about what these supports look like. So in general, in sort of office corporate workspaces, we see a disability disclosure rate of about 3 to 5%. Which is really low because the actual population of US adults with disabilities is about 20%. So a huge portion of people with disabilities don't feel comfortable coming to work are coming out at work as disabled. And Inclusively actually just did a study, and 54% of the people that they surveyed were actually actively afraid to disclose their disabilities when at work. And that is a huge problem that is at a systems level, right? The person with the disability can't solve that problem. And so you really need to be thinking about what are the ways in which your company is messaging and talking about disability and accessibility. And I'll talk more about that later. I want to talk right now about what specific supports we can have in place. So one of the supports I talk about a lot with individuals with disabilities is EAP benefit programs. So a lot of employers have employee assistance programs and benefits that are part of their package. I think it is really key that managers know what those are so that they can refer individuals to those supports and also talk about them outside of that 1 month onboarding period. The individual is learning so much during that period of time, like just about the company, but also about their role. And so I think it can be really beneficial to revisit that 2, 3, 4 months in to just remind them that those are there. The other thing I want to talk about is the accommodation process, which can be really intimidating to initiate because it feels like a black box in terms of what are we going to do? What happens when I disclose? So there's a few things I want to talk about. At Apprenti, our accommodation process is really clear on our website and in many, many places. It goes out to the apprentice many times. So you might want to think about at your organization, how difficult is it to request an accommodation? An individual is much more likely to disclose a disability to their direct manager or to somewhere on their team than they are to go directly to HR. So are your managers equipped to get that information? I always say, everybody at a company should know how to request an accommodation. And if they don't, that's a big issue because you never know who might need a disability. You yourself could need a disability at some point in time, right? So it's really important to know that information. Once someone discloses a disability, they're hopefully going to engage in that interactive process with you, wherein the individual talks about what they need to be successful in the workplace, and the employer talks about what's possible for them to implement without undue burden. Many times when I speak with apprentices, they have no idea what might be available to them. It feels like, okay, I'm struggling at work. I've identified that feeling of struggle, but I do not know what might be necessary or even possible in terms of what can be implemented. And for that, I'm going to share a resource which will go into the chat called the Job Accommodation Network. This is an excellent, excellent starting place. You can search by disability, you can search by limitation, you can search by work function, and they actually have live people that you can call as well. This is something that both an employer and an apprentice can utilize. And so I really recommend checking it out. I often say to individuals, if you know what your disability is, for example, it can just be a great place to start. Let me look up that I have a chronic migraine condition. What are some things that other people have tried? So I can just know where to start to initiate that conversation. So I think those are all things that we can think about in terms of supporting individuals with disabilities and just ensuring that that process feels welcoming. Remember, it's hugely risky for an individual to disclose a disability, and we know it feels really uncomfortable. And so at minimum, your managers should be equipped to say, thank you for sharing that information with me, and I'm interested in continuing to support you through this process because it's very, very risky from the apprentice perspective. It's a lot of sharing, and we just want to ensure that they feel like that information is safe with the people that they've shared it with. All right, I'll step back from my soapbox for a second and allow the others on the panel to share a little bit.
We're all trying to be good and not step on each other. Go ahead, Adrian.
Thanks, Carla. So a couple of things here. I would think about what it's like to not have a cushion. Some of your apprentices will be coming in with a really different socioeconomic background than other people within the organization. And so thinking about ways to provide additional supports. We touched on it briefly, thinking about food-related events, and if somebody is making a lower salary, thinking about whether there is reimbursement for parking, travel expenses can be expensed. These are things that apprentices might not be aware of, the fact that companies have those resources, or if they could front load a paycheck, if they're thinking about having the appropriate attire for work. There may be some serious financial constraints. So having employers really think about that, even thinking about when something is happening, because we're thinking about what success is for our students. If something happens, if you're observing something with your apprentice, you oftentimes are going to make an assumption about that and take an action on that assumption. For example, if somebody is showing up late, right? That's a great example where somebody may have that observation. This person is coming in late. They might make an assumption that they are lazy or that they don't care about this job enough. And then they're going to take an action based on that, of having a conversation with a student that may come in that judgmental way. That assumption, kind of what it means, should really be a conversation, if possible, with the person to unpack what's going on. Do they need to drop children off at daycare first? Is there an issue with their transportation? Sometimes if someone's car breaks down, they don't have AAA to call as a backup. They can't afford the Uber. So transportation to get to work, it's not straightforward necessarily. And I guess what I would just end with is, as we think about this, I don't want to raise these issues as kind of barriers for companies in working with apprentices or supporting some of these populations and having alternative pathways to get into your companies. I think you also really want to think about partners that you're working with. So, Franklin Cummings Tech, Bunker Hill, Apprenti, thinking about how you're supporting those individuals, maybe working with a partner who's more familiar with those with the population you're working with and can provide some of that support. So my role as the director of co-op at Franklin Cummings Tech, I have access to social workers. I have access to an emergency fund. And so if your company is nervous or has some concerns about how HR is going to address things, you can really think about partners who are doing this work, who are already prepared for this, who can provide some training. Additional supports can be there to accompany you and ensure that this is a positive outcome for both sides. Because really, the goal of having an apprentice is that the apprentice learns and is successful, as well as that your company gets a benefit out of it.
And something to think about from an employer perspective is that often the things that you're experiencing are things that are already existing within your institution. There's someone who you may already have on your team who is experiencing this, and it's hidden, and there might be some assumption. So honestly, being part of having an apprentice, really, it isn't just that apprentice, it's the whole organization, because there's different things that you were talking about that really are nuanced and impact many people, not just an apprentice. An example in terms of transportation, just to give that and from a perspective, remember the Orange Line last year? Was it last year? Many people drive. So if you're not aware of what's going on in the community, and say you're in Greater Boston area and many people are on the Orange Line and all these people are late and you're not sort of up on what's going on, you might make a judgment call because you're driving in. And remember, with that, they made sure that there were these extra pathways for people who drove, but those who relied on public transportation, not so much. So things like the parking aspect, or having just even the MBTA. The T has a lot of programs that you as an institution might have, something that the apprentice could take advantage of discounted the Charlie cards or things like that. That's important to know. The other piece is, I would say, in terms of support, we are very fortunate, just as Adrian was saying. Bunker Hill has a wealth, or we're community based, where we are have many supports that are available to our to people who are here, whether it is our single stop, whether it is our writing group, our social services, all of those pieces. So we're very fortunate to, that's something that's a framework of, we want people to succeed, so those things are baked in. But the other piece too to understand is affinity groups, as we have as well, they are wonderful. But when you're looking within your department, there should not be an expectation that the affinity group is who's going to support the individual who's coming into your department. I think that you have to look at them as a tool and an added value, but not that if something isn't done, that, oh, okay, I'm going to send it to Joe who has this affinity group. And the other piece I think that's really important is people want to be there, and that sometimes there's a first of all, culturally, you may not, telling someone that I'm struggling about something is challenging for people. Many people are raised to not share any of that information. You do not tell what's going on in my life because that's how it is. So it's important to have empathy. And we're not saying that you don't need your job to get done. Of course, that's the case. But when you have a conversation, we use, I'll say this quickly and then we can move on to the next, but we use as an example in terms of direct communication, because we've spoken about that at length, and not a passive communication. And I always use the example of someone is late. So whether it's the orange line situation or something like that, someone is late and you say to them, that's okay, just make sure, next time, or text me or what have you, but you say that's okay. So the individual is hearing that's okay, versus say they're supposed to start at a particular time because it takes time to connect into the system. And so you need them to be there 10 minutes before so they can do that because there's a very important meeting that's coming up. When you explain and are very direct with people, that they can encode that and understand that better than to just say, it's okay.
I just want to add my 2 cents to this question as well. So employers should approach success and inclusion for apprentices from all backgrounds and abilities by focusing on equity rather than equality. The terms equality and equity are often used interchangeably, but have distinct meanings. While equality would mean offering the same resources and support to all apprentices, equity requires recognizing the unique circumstances and challenges each apprentice may face and adjust support accordingly. To foster an inclusive environment, employers should assess individual needs, provide tailored support, and promote fair outcomes, not just for equal resources. By focusing on equity, employers can create an environment where success and inclusion are defined by each apprentice's ability to thrive with the necessary resources in place, supporting a truly diverse and inclusive workforce. So equity is what we really need, not equality. With that being said, what are some practices / pitfalls you've seen by employers that could potentially be barriers to an apprentice's success?
I can hop in here just to start. One thing I want to make sure is clear is that isolation is real. I talked at the beginning a little bit about making a safe space and potentially matching somebody up with a mentor slightly, a month ahead of them in the workplace. Sometimes an apprentice might not feel equipped to introduce themselves in meetings or in social settings, even to build relationships with people who maybe are much older than them or really don't look like them, doesn't seem like they share life experiences. So thinking about that, ways to incorporate the apprentice, whether it's giving them a leadership role, making sure to include them, inviting them into a conversation you're having, just being intentional about that. And then just thinking also about kind of feedback loops. We've all said this already. I don't want to harp on it too much, but just making sure that you're having one-on-ones with your apprentices about what's working and what's not working. Hear from them and try to address it. You want to be building that trust with them. And then lastly, if you're going to introduce an apprentice, language matters. So being really intentional and focusing on assets instead of deficits when you're introducing somebody, potentially checking with them ahead of time about how you want to introduce them and if they'd make any changes to that. So just, I don't mean this as like, do this, but don't do all of these other things. But do be intentional about how you're creating that space to be welcoming for them.
This is Emma. I'd love to use this question to talk about accessible interviewing because you might be eliminating apprentices or potential apprentices with disabilities before they can even get to you. And I think that can be a big challenge for employers. So when we think about accessible interviewing and accessible hiring practices, the first step would be please ensure that your job portals, mostly now people are applying online, are accessible, that they're meeting digital accessibility standards so that individuals with disabilities can apply on your website. But let's say they got through that application part and now they're at the interview stage. So one of the things that you want to make sure that you're doing is sharing details about the nature of the interview so that the individual knows what kind of accommodations to request. So for example, if I'm a wheelchair user and I know I'm attending a virtual interview, I may not need any accommodations. Or if I'm attending an interview in person, it would be helpful to know where in the building the interview is. Is there a ramp into the building? Will I be using an elevator? If maybe I am ambulatory, but it's limited, where's the parking in relation, right? All of those are things I could ask an accommodation for. But if I don't have any idea where the interview is actually happening, either at the building or within the building, it will be difficult for me to know. And it can be really challenging, right? To show up to some place and then sort of have the rug pulled out from under you. It doesn't leave you on a great foot to actually begin that interview. And then the third thing I would think about is how can you provide those questions in writing and not just verbally? Most of our interviews are sort of verbal interviews, and we assume that everyone can both retain information orally and express verbally in an impromptu manner. Now, that might be a really important skill for a certain job set in which you might want to be interviewing to weed out people who don't have that skill. But a lot of jobs do not require impromptu speaking. And so you may want to think about, are there ways in which I could set this candidate up for success? Could I be providing questions in advance? A lot of people feel really mixed about that. So if that's you, for example, you could also provide the questions in writing. At Apprenti, when we're interviewing individuals, we send a candidate prep kit that has behavioral interview questions similar to what we will be asking. So it's not exactly the same questions, but gives people an idea of what we might be asking in case they've not been to a behavioral interview before. We also provide the questions in writing in the chat since we're doing virtual interviews on Zoom. And we may also turn on the closed captioning function. When we were doing interviews in person, we sometimes provided those questions in writing on a piece of paper, which we then took back from the candidate at the end of the interview, right? So you don't have to worry about your interview questions getting out, which I know is sometimes also a concern I hear from employers. So those are just some really basic accessibility steps, but they can make a really big difference for an individual who, most people are nervous coming to interviews. And I've heard many people say, I don't have a disability, but it was really helpful to be able to just look in the chat and ensure that I had answered your full question. So I think that's a really basic thing that employers can implement quickly and easily, which can help set candidates up for success.
Adding on to that, I think what's really important for the things that we look at is historical assumption. We tend to make historical assumptions of how something should be. So pre-COVID, things were a certain way. And sometimes maybe within your institution, you still have a pre-COVID sort of setup. You might have, people's learning is different. So someone coming in who had most of their high school experience during COVID, and they worked virtually and now they're going to be in person. Some of those things, you need to look at that. What I would say for people to understand is we focus a lot on technical skills that people have, things that they can learn. Right? When we talk about growth mindset, et cetera, fixed mindset. So people learn things technically, et cetera. The piece that I think is really important to understand is this social emotional aspect of it. People don't leave jobs often because they technically can't do something. They leave jobs because of how something made them feel, how the interaction, that isolation, all of those things. So I think it's important for us to understand that. Sometimes we might look at things and say, well, I didn't have that when I was, doing this. Well, you also didn't go through COVID, and you also weren't in this environment, and you also didn't have a cell phone, a smartphone to handle that. So if I'm in school and I've been used to doing things technical, even people who are older got into the handle of using your phone, which is very different than email. Those aspects of it. The other piece is, and when we're talking about how we see things, age and community. So I once was in a meeting and I got a pushback because we were talking about age and programs. Our program is 18 plus, high school degree, 18 plus. Someone might have advanced degrees, etc. Um, and they were saying, well, it's very different, someone who is a young adult versus someone who's older in the workplace and how they perceive things. And I said, no, that's not true. The difference is how they handle the situation, but they feel the same way. So if I'm 18, if I'm a young adult and something is happening in the workplace and I'm not feeling great about it, I might ghost you. That's how I handle it. But I'm feeling the same way. Whereas I'm someone who might be in my 30s. I'm just picking a random number. And I have those same scenarios, but I'm going to tell you about it. So I'm going to say to you, this is the reason why I'm leaving. So I think it's important that we look at, when we have people in spaces, that aspect of it, and not make an assumption of someone's response. And my last thing in terms of that, of what we look at, is it's a community. There's the community within your organization. There's a community within someone's family. There's a community within the people that they interact with. And all of those social aspects of it impact people at work. So if I'm a young adult and I'm expected to dress a certain way, and I have to now leave my house where all these other people who aren't dressed that certain way, there's something, that dynamic that I have to deal with that. Or I'm going into a space of no one in my family has this same experience. And so they may be looking at things and saying, who do you think you are? So we have to understand that there's a deep social, an emotional aspect of these opportunities. And the expectation is not for the employer to fix it, but to sort of remind you that, yes, you're seeing it firsthand in an apprenticeship because some people have not had that experience in this space. But trust me, these things exist within your current organization. And it's important for us to, I think, especially post-COVID, to be mindful of them, and how and maybe perhaps when you reflect upon it, might say, oh, I'm looking at these things historically and how we did things, and perhaps I need to kind of look at what the environment is currently to change that.
Thank you, Carla. In the interest of time, I wanted to open up some the floor to our audience and see if there's any questions so that we can answer those as well. Mike, I see in the chat that you wrote, please use the Q&A feature. I do not see any questions currently right now.
Yes, while the questions are coming in, I have one.
Okay.
And so, the apprenticeship model is interesting because a lot of the times the apprentices are kind of switching from one aspect of the experience to the other. I'm doing my sort of educational training component, and now I'm doing my on-the-job experience. Now I'm doing the mentorship. How should employers think about helping the apprentices navigate between those transitions? And anyone on the floor can respond to that.
I think you build it into your program. I think, something that we've done before is in the orientation piece, have that the cohort, if it's a cohort or individual, that we are working collaboratively, that the process is a collaborative process, that they know up front. So we're risky in the sense of the employers meeting somebody who is in the first part, the educational part, because they're in this particular program, it was 10 and 10. So what I look like in week 1 is going to look very different than what I look like in week 10. So it's to be mindful of that, but to let people know that this is a real thing, that you are working and achieving to do this so that you can get to this piece, and all of these steps build into that. When you get to OJT, you're going to then utilize it's experiential. You're going to be using that when you get into work versus they're separate components. So I think it's important that the instructors understand the OJT piece, that's understood in it, and that perhaps in an orientation way that you as an organization, all the entities who will be interacting with the apprentice meet them up front.
Yes, to just build off what Carla said, we found it hugely impactful to have the manager or mentor reach out to the apprentice while they are still in that technical classroom-based learning and saying, like we were talking about earlier, really enforcing, we're excited to have you on the team. We can't wait for you to get to be part of it. And, we've worked with some employers who have the opportunity to be able to do some sort of planned social engagement, come to the office for a day, or, do that sort of thing that allows the apprentice to get exposure to what that on the job might be. And so it feels like, I think like what Adrienne was saying earlier, that there just is a champion there's somebody that's connected with them who's seen them through those earlier pieces. It does not have to be a lot, I think, for it to be meaningful for the apprentice to just know, these are the faces I know when I arrive, to my on-the-job training.
I think my colleagues did a really good job on covering this one. I'm not sure that I have anything concrete to add to those transitions. I think it's just the preparation that you're doing in advance. So whether that's communicating in advance for what they should expect, giving them that opportunity to see how it's going to be slightly different, having the students have a chance, or it depends on where the apprentices are coming from, right? They're not all coming from educational institutions. So the prep work in advance is important.
I'll say this, as a former apprentice at Accenture, when I started, I wanted to vomit. I was so anxious. And it was so unnerving, the fact that I was even given this opportunity, and I was called a product engineer associate. That was my formal title. I went from boot camp called Resilient Coders to now I'm a product engineer associate at Accenture, and I could just vomit thinking about just the expectations and what was I going to do. And my first day, I literally turn on the computer and there's a whole bunch of other apprentices like me, and they were like, "You're going to be doing the first month, we're going to teach you. We're just going to teach you everything. And this is how we do things here." And they took an approach that was very human centric. And it was just like, you are truly human. It is okay to be you. It is okay to be seen. You are safe, affirmed me, helped me. And it was kind of like, okay, the first month, it's like Accenture school. And then they're like, and now we're going to teach you and enroll you into this course that it's going to help you potentially on a future client. So then I did B2B Salesforce Commerce Cloud, and that was what we did. And then from there, it was like, and now you're going to shadow in a client. And if they give you a couple things to do, don't freak out because it's not chargeable. And they know where you're supposed to be at. And so I went to a client, and there was some hiccups there, but given that I was given the resources and the tools, I felt safe to advocate for myself and say, no, this is not that. And this is what I'm supposed to be doing, and let's course correct. And the only way I was able to do that was given the fact that they started me off with such it was like a perfect blend. And then as an apprentice at Accenture, they were like, okay, so you can get on these roles, but you're not chargeable. We expect you to have mistakes, and we expect you to have questions, and we expect you to have all these different things happening to you, but don't freak out. You're safe. Nobody's going to fire you. Nobody's going to say, get out of here. You're terrible. We are expecting you to make mistakes, and that is okay. And the fact that they told me it's okay if I made a mistake or if I didn't know how to do something, or it was ooh, I actually picked the right place, because in the days when I woke up and I was like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing, there was moments where it was but it's okay because I'm still wanted. They still want to see me. I'm not doing anything bad per se. I'm still learning. And that was really beautiful. And I think that's what creates the longevity of apprentices in the Accenture community graduating, because we are affirmed day in and day out that we are supposed to be here. And we're not just like with the apprentice title. It's like I had a big girl title. Like I went from a secretary to an executive assistant, I should say, to like a product engineer associate. What the freak, Like, oh my gosh.
I think Asiana really touched on the importance of structure there too, just in terms of, and if you can share that structure ahead of time, even better with the
Yeah.
apprentices. So if she had known that was going to be the first day, that may have helped with that feeling of vomiting. And that structure, it doesn't allow for just like downtime of people wondering what they're supposed to be doing and room for disengagement. So thinking about that structure, what you're going to provide, is really, really important. It does look like there's a question.
Yes, I see it here. Why don't I just read it out loud? So we have a question from Yvonne. Hi, Yvonne. How can a larger company that has a very traditional environment like finance create a culture that is more inclusive? I've had experience with companies using DEI meetings as a way to inform their traditional community about inequalities, but oftentimes people of color do not find this tactic helpful and it promotes isolation. How would you all modify this model?
I can answer that one. So a lot of the program, the most recent program I had are corporate finance, insurance, those places. It is, I'd say, and this is probably for everything, is the department that gets placed or used isn't always the department that wants to have someone. So you need to have a department that understands the expectations of the role and the people who are going to be in it. Because you'll have people who just need a body to do work and they're not going to fulfill the other aspects of being an apprentice. So in the finance, I mean, there's a lot of things going on. And once you have a champion, and then you ask the question departmentally of, they always send out the thing who's interested. But the next piece is what are you in that department? What's your objective? And these are the different things that we have as goals for this role for the individual. Do you feel that this is something that you can fulfill? In this area, or is there a particular skill set that we can then understand better, that will align with that department? Often what happens is we get, and I know it's probably gonna be crude, but this is the way that I use it, is we're not looking for pat people on the head like they're a dog. And we don't want programs that do that. And what I mean by that is, aren't you lucky that you're here? And that's common. And the way that you could address that, especially in a larger institution, is that education. Because all it takes, honestly, it takes one. Often it's the person who does that behind the scenes, who does an unofficial mentorship. Those are the ones that you want to target and sort of encourage those organizations to target. Because all it takes is one success, and then they're competitive, especially in that space. And they want, okay, you have this person here, you're treating them a certain way, and they're seeing the success of that. And then that person, it's sort of that they tell two friends and so on and so on and so on. So I think a lot of it is how you're communicating that, but others to speak to that. But it's hard in that area, but it is you have to explain to them, even though they think that they already know.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not easy. And I think one of the things I think a lot about with accessibility, as part of the DEI is thinking about, rather than locating the need for accessibility in the person with the disability, or rather than isolating the people of color or sort of tokenizing those individuals, act like the people are already there because they are already there. And hopefully your organization wants them in roles if for some reason they're not already in those, higher level roles. And so rather than thinking of like, we offer sign language interpreting, but now only, or we turn the closed captions on in meetings only because we have someone who is deaf at the office. Instead, how do we flip that to, it is an important value to us that everyone is able to engage. And so even when, that deaf person moves on from the role, we will continue to promote that ideology within our organization. And so I think, finding ways to shift from informational, like you don't know, they aren't here, we don't, and you can fill in the they with whatever, piece you want. Shifting from that informational to actionable inclusion steps, I think can be really impactful, and starting small is okay too. Like, at our organization, starting by sending out presentations in advance. A lot of people benefit from getting presentations in advance, not just people with disabilities, and is a practice that the organization should really be implementing, not just for, a given individual who may ask for that sort of thing.
I think what I would add, sorry, I know we're trying to end quickly, but I would just add, the conversation, who the conversation is coming from, is important. So if it's just messaging that comes from DEI and it doesn't come from supervisors or managers, or kind of conversations that are happening in the office anyway, that's a problem. And so, I would say early managers can use training, and oftentimes I think that they can handle it. Carla was talking about, like, people, if you ask them, they're going to say yes, so they can. But offering additional training, having realistic conversations ahead of time, again, about reflecting on the culture, the workplace, what's on the walls. Is that in conflict with what you're telling people your culture is? In one of the prep calls, Carla said that she really doesn't like when people say, like, we're a family. And I think that that's really important to think about, like, how that might not make everyone feel comfortable in that space. So I'll leave it there and I'll let you wrap up, Mike.
No, I'm glad you chimed in there. That was wonderful. So please, thank you very much to everyone who attended, and thank you very much to all of the wonderful speakers. I really, really appreciate your time and you lending your expertise here. As I said at the top, if anyone in the audience has any questions at all about the Massachusetts Apprentice Network, please feel free to contact me. And I really do hope that you consider joining us on November 20th for our National Apprenticeship Week celebration at Suffolk University. I'll be sending out more information and details in the days ahead. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and happy trick-or-treating to all.
Thank you
Bye.
all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Have a good one. Be great.